8, the honourable member for Parry Sound, Muskoka.
Thank you very much, Madam Speaker. I appreciate that. I will be sharing my time, actually, with the member for Saanich Gulf Islands. As I prepared to talk today about this Bill C-3, I couldn't help, of course, like many of us, I'm sure, think back about what we've experienced and learned over the course of our lives. And of course, I'm firmly ensconced in white, middle-aged, white guy now zone. But I started out in public life, of course, really as quite a young guy. I was 21 when I was first elected to Huntsville Town Council and the Muskoka Regional Council, and I didn't know anything. I was fairly clueless and needed to learn an awful lot. And among the first things I learned about was the needs that exist in my community. There's a perception, of course, of Muskoka as a playground of the rich and the famous, and that everything is rainbows and sunshine. And yet the reality, of course, in a place like Muskoka, and certainly the entire part of my riding, Parry Sound and Muskoka, is that the people who live and work in these communities year-round, their median income is about 20% lower than the provincial average. There are struggles. There's a housing crisis. And there are a lot of social problems that I certainly as a kid tended to think really only existed in places like big cities. I was actually in the home of a good friend, now a former mayor, but he wasn't mayor then, but his name is Claude Doughty from Huntsville. He was a dentist in town and left his dental practice to become a developer, and he's built lots of wonderful things. His wife, Kim Doughty, is one of the most dynamic women I've ever known. We were sitting in his house, and he lives in a beautiful home overlooking Fairy Lake. It's gorgeous, absolutely stunning place. We were sipping on a Heineken and thinking that, wasn't this all wonderful, and we've got great things going on in our town. And Claude's wife, Kim, came home, and she was clearly upset. She'd had a difficult day, and I knew that she had worked at that time with Muskoka Victim Services. And so I asked her what happened today. And she proceeded to tell me some of the most tragic and heart-wrenching stories that I'd ever heard. And what struck me more than anything was that these situations that she described, these traumas, this fear, this anxiety that existed literally blocks away from this home in the lap of luxury overlooking Fairy Lake. Claude and I were both really quite distraught by what we heard and decided that we needed to do something. And so we got to work. I immediately spoke with the executive director of Muskoka Women's Advocacy Group, which ran a shelter for women in Bracebridge called Interval House, because we recognized that we needed to do more for North Muskoka and certainly into the Parry Sound area. And so with Claude's building expertise, he donated a piece of land. We started a campaign that consumed the community. And we were able to build a 6-room shelter and 10-unit transitional housing facility for women escaping violence in their own home. As that project started, I got to know an awful lot more people in the social service industry and business in our area. And one of the other amazing people I met through the process of starting this was a woman by the name of Carolyn Bray. Carolyn Bray was the executive director of the YWCA of Muskoka. They called it the Y Without Walls. It wasn't about gyms, it was about programs and supporting women and girls. And I learned a lot from Carolyn about the issue of sexual violence and how, yes, there are most certainly victims, but she recognized the importance of not just supporting women and girls, but in helping little boys who may have grown up in a circumstance where they saw domestic violence. They saw the way their father treated their mother. And because of their own lack of understanding, their own fears, their own anxiety, their own mental health model the same behavior when they become intimate partners. Section 7 of the Charter of Rights and Freedoms says that everyone has the right to life, liberty, and security of the person. Security. This word means without care, without anxiety. Sadly, we know not all Canadians experience security. Sexual assault is the only violent crime in Canada that is not declining. 67% of Canadians know a woman who has experienced sexual violence. Roughly 6,000 women and children sleep in shelters on any given night in our country. Despite these numbers, only 5% of sexual assaults were reported to police in 2014. And we know that it's because of the fear. We've heard people talk about how women are afraid to approach the justice system for fear of being re-victimized and reliving the pain of the experience. Madam Speaker, I've had the privilege of growing up and learning in public life into this role. And as shocking as what I heard those many years ago in the lovely home of Mr. Dowdy, it's dismaying, of course, that we are still here talking about these things and that we haven't solved these problems. And so, to me, Bill C-3 is an important next step. It's really a minor next step. We have much, much more work to do, Madam Speaker. I am honored that I have the opportunity to be here to speak in favor of this bill. I'm really thrilled as a new member of Parliament who sees how oftentimes seemingly dysfunctional this place can be and how it takes forever to get anything done, that everybody gets the importance of this bill and of supporting women and ensuring that all women feel the same security and liberty that I feel. Thank you, Madam Speaker. I look forward to any questions.
Questions and comments? The honourable member for Kingston and the Islands.
Thank you very much, Madam Speaker, and I appreciate my colleague's intervention today. I really was listening attentively when he talked about Interval House and the work that he and his community had done to set that up. My mother worked for, back in the early 90s, for Interval House in Kingston for quite a while, and you really got to see some of the hardships that women were facing coming from abusive relationships, and the work that Interval House could do to actually significantly change lives. I'm wondering, I know he talked about creating Interval House. Can you talk a little bit about the results that came as a result of having that Interval House in his community?
The honourable member for Parry Sound.
I want to thank the honourable member for Kingston and the Islands for the question because it's something that I did want to speak to. It's had a tremendous impact. And I can share a quick story that was in the newspaper about a woman who had lived in a 17-year abusive situation with her ex-husband. She left, she wound up in another one in North Bay, and she left, and she made it to Chrysalis House in Huntsville, which is the facility that we had built. And she didn't have bruises, it wasn't a recent event, and yet she made it to Chrysalis House. She was scared. She didn't know if they would accept her. She was offered a place to stay that was warm, safe, and without judgment. And she said it was a feeling she hadn't known in 22 years, if you can imagine. She's doing really well. She stayed in the shelter. She's able to move into the transitional apartment units next door where there was support. She could get her life back together. She could get a job. She's doing really well. And I'm really proud of my role in playing to get that place built.
Questions and comments? Questions et commentaires? L'honorable député.
The honourable member for Berthier-Maskinongé. Thank you, Madam Speaker, and I'd like to thank my colleague for his speech. I think all of my colleagues would agree that this is a bill of crucial importance. It's very important for the protection of victims and improvement of our justice system. I'd like to hear my colleague perhaps reassure all of us, including Canadians, because there are some critics who say that this bill could perhaps make the court system less independent. Quite the opposite, I think. The more training, the better, and it might undo some myths or stereotypes. So I'd like to hear what my colleague has to say about that. Thank you.
Parry Sound, Muskoka?
I appreciate the question, and I think it's an important point to make that you can't have too much education. I guess there's no question that there are biases, there are myths, there are misunderstandings, and as a society we evolve, and it's important for all of us to evolve along with it. And so I would just simply say that a little more education is always a good thing.
Questions and comments? The honourable member for Winnipeg Centre.
Yes, thank you, Madam Speaker, and I'd like to once again thank my honourable colleague for his comments. He spoke a lot about domestic violence, but we know that many women who experience violence aren't necessarily in a domestic dispute. In fact, if you look at the findings of the National Inquiry into Murdered and Missing Indigenous Women and Girls, many women experience violence as a result of, for example, not having proper housing. Not having safe places to stay. And I really, am thankful for the work he's done to find safe spaces for women. I'm wondering if, in addition to training around issues that women face in courts, if he also thinks that it's important to include in that training issues of systemic racism and poverty and how that impacts women seeking justice who have experienced sexual violence.
The honourable member for Parry Sound, Muskoka, a brief answer, please.
I'd like to thank my colleague for the question, and it's a completely important and accurate point, and it's one of the reasons why I'm pleased that one of the amendments that was made in committee is to actually include training related to systemic racism and bias that exists in our society. So I'm glad that that's in there, and we could talk about housing for many more hours, but that's one of the other reasons I came here, to talk about housing. So I appreciate your question.